That rule is ATCP 51, and that's what we're going to be evaluating here. So the law itself required our department to evaluate this rule every 4 years. So this rule came into effect in 2006. We're at that 4-year mark, so we're conducting this evaluation. We want your input about what works and what doesn't work, and what you think we need to look at as we go forward. One thing, which is the last bullet point here, is in the law itself there's a series of statements of legislative intent which our department needed to use when we develop the rule and also when we evaluate that rule. One of the handouts in the back has a list of what those statements in the law actually are, so if you want to look at them. Next slide, please. Okay, the first thing we need to make very clear is this rule, ATCP 51, the livestock sighting rule, it's an option for local governments that want to issue permits for new or expanding livestock operations. And that basically means an ordinance at either the county, town, city, or village level has to be adopted, and that ordinance would incorporate the standards, procedures, timelines, and some other things in the sighting rule. That's what local government needs to use when they evaluate applications for expansions, or when a farmer applies for an expansion, that's what they need to comply with, the series of standards. There are a whole host of other rules and regulations that these farms also need to comply with, and they don't go away. So the sighting rule is pretty specific. Other issues like road weight limits and where farms belong according to zoning, those still apply, but they're dealt with separately. And when these permits are issued locally, they're also enforced locally. So counties or towns are the ones who are dealing with the farmers directly, and they determine if there's compliance or not with the standards when they determine to grant or deny an application and to enforce them over time. The rule does have a provision for local governments to adopt more stringent regulation. By that, we mean more stringent than the standards in the sighting law. I'll be going over the standards in the next few slides, but basically, if a county or town wants a more stringent standard for one of these farm expansions, they're going to need to have a public health and safety reason for doing that, which they back up with scientific findings of fact. That's required by the law. Example of that might be if they have a odor standard, they want to go beyond that, and they need to have findings why they're doing it, and something that they would have to back up locally if it's decided. The last bullet point up here mentions the livestock performance standards. They apply to all the farms in the state. They're basically the water quality standards related to runoff and manure management. So if a local government would want a more stringent standard for when they issue a permit for these farms that are expanding, and it happens to be more restrictive than the state performance standards under a different law, they would need a water quality justification for doing that. An example of that would be if they wanted a more restrictive manure spreading requirement, and it's more restrictive than what is in both laws. They would have to get public health and safety reasons under livestock sighting law, and then also water quality justifications under the statute 9215. The water quality justification would need Department of Natural Resources and Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection approval. Next slide. So I guess the big question is, who actually has adopted the livestock sighting rule locally, and how is it going for them? Well, there's two ways that sighting ordinances are getting adopted locally. It's either a conditional use permit requirement that's in a zoning ordinance, and those here are shown in green, and then it could be a licensing ordinance, which is shown in brown. The map in the back of the room is basically split between county and town. The big difference between the two ways this ordinance would be adopted locally is if it's zoning, it's under typical zoning ordinance, and there's about 1,000 towns in the state which are covered by zoning, and there's also about 250 that have no zoning. So in those areas without zoning, they could adopt a licensing ordinance. They get the same livestock sighting standards required for farms. It's just they don't have zoning to back up their land use decisions. But farmers have to do the same things in either case. So there's about 62 local governments that have adopted an ordinance to regulate these farm expansions. Next slide. All right, the first thing that's really important with these expansions, and if they are even covered under the livestock sighting rule, is the sighting rule only applies to cattle, swine, poultry, sheep, and goat operations. Farms that have different types of animals, like horses or buffaloes, that's a different regulation possibly to cover them. So this rule is geared to production agriculture, and also for the bigger farms. So we're thinking 500 animal units or more. And that's basically 357 milking cows, or if you've got a herd with maybe 270 milkers and an equal number of young stock, that would be equivalent to 500 animal units. And this animal unit number that gets written onto these permit applications is important, because all the designs that are going to comply with the standards I'll be talking about in the next few slides here, that's what they're based on. So the farm has to prove they can manage their farm when it's fully populated with all the animals and everything works out. There is some variability throughout the state with this permit number. I know Chippewa County is at 650 animal units. They decided to go higher than 500, and a few places in the state which had been requiring conditional use permits before the siting rule, they were able to grandfather lower permit thresholds. So next slide. All right, setbacks is the first standard which is in the rule. The siting law allows local governments to use a smaller standard or smaller setback distance than we have in the rule. The rule's setback distance applies from farm structures, the barns, manure storage, animal lots, those types of things, to property lines and roads. There are other setbacks which are basically incorporated, and that would be like shoreline zoning setbacks, or any setbacks that are in the DNR well code for distances between wells and buildings. But the siting rule is basic, it's property line and road setbacks to structures. Next. All right, odor and air emissions. This standard was new, this was a new standard 4 years ago when the rule came into place. And so basically, how do you know if you comply or not with this rule? It's a predictive model which DATCP 51 has incorporated, and it bases an odor score on the distance of parts of the farm that smell or have the potential to smell. We're thinking manure storage structures, animal lots where the barns are with animals in them. Those types of structures get measured to the nearest neighbor. So it's not to the property line, but to the nearest neighbor. And this model predicts based on distance, direction, and what types of practices are used if a facility will comply with the odor standard or not. The standard does not consider land spreading of manure. It's only the production area on these farms, where the animals are kept year-round. A few facilities are exempt from the standard, but they can voluntarily comply if they want to. Okay, next slide. This is usually the big one we hear the most about, is nutrient management planning. In layman's terms, it's manure spreading. This rule requires that all the manure on this farm that's produced by these animals gets accounted for all of the time. So in effect, that means the farmers have to come up with a nutrient management plan that meets the Natural Resources Conservation Service standard 590 for nutrient management. So the manure goes out to cropland the right time of year, the right amounts, and in the right place. And that includes also determining what the land base is and having a plan that's solid for all those animals. So if the farm's going to slowly grow over a number of years, when they apply for the local permit, they have to have that plan geared out for what they're going to be in the future, not just what they are today.